Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gonzalez, and on behalf of the Biology Department at South Texas College, we would like to thank you for spending your evening with us for this speaker series event. Throughout the talk, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and also add your name so that if your question is selected, we can give you credit. Let me go ahead and give you some background information about our speaker and what this talk will entail. So for today, we have Mr. John Dale. John Dale is American Forest Director for Texas and Mexico and has been working to conserve biodiversity and landscapes in the Southwest for over 20 years. American Forest is a national nonprofit organization that focuses on restoring and conserving forests throughout North America for the benefit of both people and ecosystems. The lower Rio Grande Valley is one of the few North American geographies where subtropical ecosystems and their associated wildlife ranges into the US. However, ongoing development has reduced the extent of our region's historically dominant land cover, Tamaulipan thorn scrub, by more than 90% over the past century. Despite this, remnant forest patches continue to support high levels of biodiversity. The RGV counts more bird species than any other state, 519 to be exact. Almost 60% of the entire number of butterfly species recorded in the US and more than 1,200 species of plants. This presentation will give participants an overview of the region's thorn forest ecosystem, including efforts being made to conserve it through reforestation, science, and planning. And with that, John, you may go ahead and start as soon as you're ready.
Thank y'all for having me. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that amazing introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Happy to be here. And so can y'all see that now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, I'll go to presenter mode here. Yeah, so I thank y'all, everyone. My work here in the Valley, so I represent Texas, but most of my work for American Forest occurs here in the Valley, and then I also do work in northern Mexico. So it's really it's kind of a unique role looking at the forest ecosystem in this part of the world. When people generally talk about forest ecosystems, they're talking about like the Western United States or some of the eastern parts of the country where you have huge, by our standards, huge tall trees, 60, 70, 80 feet, foot tall trees. So I know forest is kind of a semantics thing, but for the purposes of our discussion today, we'll focus, we'll talk about what we have here, which is our thorn scrub or not thorn forest ecosystem. And let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to give you an overview of the forest ecology and kind of the management components that go with that down here in the Valley. And then we'll talk about some of the conservation issues and just in general, natural resource conservation issues for the region. As Elizabeth mentioned, American Forest, this is the organization I work for. Most people are not familiar with American Forests in the Valley. So that's why I'm here, right? Part of the reason. We're a national nonprofit focused on preserving forests and their benefits to both people and nature. So that's really important to kind of comprehend or kind of, internalize. This is not just about, restoring forest or conserving forests for the benefit of species. That's part of the issue or part of the MO or the mission statement of the organization, but it's also really about people. If we're not solving some of society's issues, some of society's problems, but through forest conservation, then it's really hard to justify looking at some of these deeper kind of concerns over species if you can't project that for folks, the value of saving forests and preserving forests for people. So it's both of those things for our organization. We have two major national programs. And the first one is in no particular order. We have what we call a tree equity program that's focused on urban forests. So if you think about all those trees that are growing in the city in the different neighborhoods, that's an urban forest canopy. And so, this is a program that is found in we have a presence in pretty much all the major cities nationwide. And that includes, not so much here in the Valley at this stage, but that includes, Dallas, Houston, some of the larger Texas cities, San Antonio. We've got some tree equity work going on in those areas. And then the other national program is Resilient Forest. That's my program. And our focus is it's more broader, looking at the landscape level. So those, the actual forests themselves, the work in habitat restoration, place-based partnerships, and really all of what we're talking about today. And you'll see this numerous times. And it's very much, it's very, very much in tune for the audience, I think, tonight. It's science-based planning. We're not just going out and, talking anecdotally or that kind of thing about what we're doing. We're backing it up with science, and we're using science to inform our planning. So that's a real critical component to have, in any of these, larger efforts to conserve natural resources. And so, I just wanted to add a slide in here about the value of forests. If there's any, doubt among listeners or folks, just, not super kind of dialed in maybe on what that means, here or in other parts of the country. But, so in urban forests, these are areas that are obviously already impacted by development, and so trees in these kinds of environments provide, cleaner air. And one of the things that we talk about here in the Valley and other areas is, of the Southwest or the South is how much trees mitigate, the heat and what we call the heat island effect. You have all that cement and all that asphalt and pavement in these built up areas. And when you plant trees, they cool that landscape. Just having the canopy, the shade canopy, or the shade provided by the canopy, and the respiration from the trees and that kind of thing. So it's I think all of us from the Valley can attest to that, the value of having those trees for residents. And you most normally see these things in outside of our backyards. You're going to have that urban forest canopy in parks, public centers, right of ways, like up and down the street, that kind of thing. And so that's in the urban environment, and then if we look at the rural forestry component, the value of maintaining. So if you've been out west, looking at these huge landscapes that are forested in the mountains, that kind of thing, a lot of those are public lands out west, to a lesser extent in the east. And those public lands, a lot of them are forested, right? And so, you have landscape level processes that are going on in there. And I just threw one in here. I said, watershed function. But if you're living in one of those areas, you're getting your drinking water from a river, well, like we do down here, right, from the Rio Grande, but after it's gone through treatment a million times. But that the benefit of having that, that watershed forested, those higher elevations, the reduction in runoff, that keeps the sediment out of the river and all those kinds of things. I mean, it's a lot of these processes come back at the end of the day, and they're really, the processes that we depend on as society, whether it's drinking water or water for industry, that kind of thing. But if you don't have those forests and those landscapes, it really cuts down on the quality of some of those resources. So, and then not so much here in the Valley, but in a lot of forested landscapes throughout the U.S., you have commercial forestry. You have, forests that are being planted and harvested at certain intervals. What they call rotations. Like if you go to Mississippi or Alabama or some of those southeastern states or even East Texas, the forests that you're looking at in there when you drive by are on rotations. They were planted, some of those patches were planted, 50, 60 years ago. And at a certain age, they'll be harvested, and then that section will be replanted. So if you think about the Valley, you think about how big farming has been to us down here. Well, that's their version of farming in those areas. A lot of times they don't have as much arable land for growing or that kind of thing, vegetables or row crops. So they're the way they use the land in those places is for economic development. It's for forestry, which is an economic development strategy. And then in rural areas, generally speaking, you've got some forests that are not harvested. Like if you go to Idaho or Montana up around Yellowstone National Park, some of those ecosystems have what are called, or those national forest units up there, public lands again, have what are called wilderness areas. And those wilderness areas are not. There's explicit management guidelines where they don't actually do harvest. So it might be like old growth of a certain species of forest, and that's where you might have grizzly bears or some other rare species up in that area. So it's a strategy for species conservation. The way the different guidelines for managing forest and rural areas. And then, of course, there's overlap in many geographies, areas just outside of cities that are in the path of development, that kind of thing. And we'll kind of, get into a little bit more of that here in a minute, because that obviously applies to the valley. Urban forests, just a little bit of a deeper dive here. When we talk about urban forests, there's really, you look at what kind of trees you have on the landscape. You take like an inventory of the trees that are out there, and then you also look at parts of the cities that could probably stand to use more. They could probably use more tree canopy to kind of cool the residents in those different areas. So it's important to do like inventories, and as long as you're out there looking at that canopy, you want to kind of look at the tree health. Trees are like people; they decline over time. And so it's important to kind of keep your eye on, what might need to be replaced or that kind of thing. And then, the multi-use goals are really important on the planning. So these are urban areas, right? So we need to have these landscapes, accessible to residents for not just recreation, but also for educational purposes, and those kinds of things. There's a lot of things that could obviously fit in there. Management, again, science-based, looking at proper tree care and maintenance. What does that look like in a given geography? What are the benefits of kind of spreading information on best practices, that kind of thing on tree care. That's really important. If we want to maintain these canopies, these urban tree canopies for a long time. And then, to the extent possible, this really comes down to almost really another economic strategy. There's all that kind of thing is woven into forest management, trying to, in this case, advancing career pathways, folks that are kind of, their careers or their business is built around landscaping, that kind of thing. So that's all part of the equation for urban forestry. I think a lot of times here in the valley, we don't think about it like that, but as the valley urbanizes, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from other areas that have already been down the road that we have been, that are already fully urbanized or already built out and that kind of thing. So it's important to kind of have like open lines of communication with other parts of the state or the country, that kind of thing, when it comes to these kinds of things. Threats for urban forests, pest and disease outbreaks. There's a lot of pests out there that, exotic pests, maybe pests from other countries that are kind of imported into the area, or just kind of, homegrown ones. So, I mean, there's always that issue of losing trees to that. I think we always talk about the Dutch elm disease. That's kind of like the classic version of how the introduction of one pathogen basically has wiped out an entire species of native tree in the United States. In this case, the American elm. I don't have a link here, but if you'll go online and look at that, you'll hear the whole kind of heartbreaking story about how American elm as a species, it's not native to the valley, but how that's declined so precipitously over quickly over the last 100 years. There's also natural decline. There's some trees out there that just don't live past a certain age. We here in the valley, we have the ash trees that a lot of folks have, and those are early successional trees. They're riparian trees, and they don't, compared to an oak tree, they don't live as long. And there's pros and cons to that when it comes to the way species use those trees and those kinds of things, if we're looking at the wildlife aspect. But natural decline is a threat. And then just bad tree care practices, topping trees and kind of, cutting them or trimming them the wrong way, that can open them up for that's the precursor for pest and disease outbreaks a lot of the time. You may not have an issue with pest and disease, and then you kind of, go after the tree and maybe trim it the wrong way, and then suddenly you do have an issue. The pests will find it. They always find it. Rural forests, just really quickly, natural processes. We'll talk about this in a second. This is important to kind of, remember, is succession as a process. And then, and as part of that process, and then really almost, kind of on its own is disturbance. So, the frequency and the intensity of things like fires, and on the visual there on the top part is a fire in the Western US, and fires are natural in that ecosystem out West. The question is, it's not really a question. I mean, the issue at hand is that, in recent years, in the last 100+ years, which is fairly recent in terms of the time scale of forests, right? Because these are living systems. Forests are living systems that live for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. So that's their scale. Forests are not operating on the human lifespan scale. Yes, there was fire historically in a lot of these, what are called fire adapted ecosystems out West, but it's that intensity and the frequency that has really gone through the roof, so to speak, in the last, few generations, because of that fire suppression that different, land managers have practiced over the last 100 years, kind of not going in and clearing out the understory, letting a lot of dead wood kind of fall off the trees and just kind of hang out under the trees. That's all a recipe for disaster. So, and then climate change, a changing climate exacerbates these disturbances and turns them into something that might have been garden variety, but now it's like off the chart, and now it's like, catastrophic kind of thing. Management, prescribed fire, exactly for the reasons I just described, is really important. Going in and kind of burning that understory out, or getting rid of that dead wood, or thinning, what they call thinning stands of trees. Those are really important aspects of management in rural forests. And then I think I mentioned this earlier, harvest, and the cycle of harvest and reforestation is really important. And then ecological restoration in some of these areas where it might be more, the ecosystem might be more fragile, and you're going for a certain kind of long-term impact, maybe where you're not going to do harvest, that kind of thing. And you're just trying to kind of set things back to maybe the way they were at a certain point, and for the benefit of a, particular wildlife species or that kind of thing. And then the threats, y'all have heard of these over and over again. I'll just kind of reiterate them. The changing climate, whether it's extreme forest fires or, other examples of this are basically what's called altitudinal migration. There's other ways to say this, but, where, you look at a mountain and the lower elevations of, where there's a bunch of tree species, say a pine species was growing there. And now they can't survive in that band, like say the 4,000 to 6,000 foot range on a mountain. And now they have to kind of migrate. They have to kind of migrate up towards the top for cooler conditions, like closer to the top of the mountain, maybe at 7,000 or 8,000. So we're actually seeing that. We see that in the Western United States. We see that in Mexico. And if you didn't know, Mexico is mostly a country of mountains. So we see a lot of that. And then of course in the tropics, as you go further down in the different tropical forest ecosystems, that kind of thing, you see that as well. And so when those forests move, all the species that depend on them, they either move with them, or guess what, they don't make it. That kind of thing. So there's a lot of that going on in today's world. Threats, the final one there, well, illegal logging, I mean, we see that everywhere. And then urban encroachment for sure in some of these areas that are just, urban areas that are kind of inside of these, forested ecosystems. We're seeing that as well. This is just a real basic kind of visual for forest succession. You probably have saw like, middle school handbook or textbook, but and not all of these stages apply to every geography, right? We don't start out with bare rock here in the valley, right? But I mean, just imagine like an old farm field. That would be like the fill in or the stand in for bare rock. And then you kind of go through a grass stage, and then it kind of, if you're not going in, and this is what happens naturally. Ideally, if you're not going in and manipulating it, this is what could happen. You'll have the grasses and then the woody pioneers, like the early successional trees. So like here in the valley, that's mesquite or huisache, those kinds of species show up like really quick, but they don't live very long. They're early, that's what we call early successional species. And then you get some of these other species that like ebony, Texas ebony, some of these other species that are like long term. They take a long time to grow, and you find those more in like what we call a climax forest. So they're on the graph. So that's just real basic. We're getting to the valley. We'll be there in a few slides here. To really understand the valley, I mean, you have to what we really need here is a picture of both Texas and Mexico, because our thorn forest and our thorn scrub ecosystem is much more, our landscape is much closer in biodiversity and ecosystem wise. It has much more in common with Tamaulipas than it does like the rest of Texas. But I just threw this on here because it's good. It's good to kind of see the differences in the rest of the state. We're part of, these are ecoregions. They're variously termed in the literature bioprovinces, I think is another name for them. The state is kind of, Texas Parks and Wildlife is like, renamed them several times, over the years, but we're part of the South Texas Plains. Then you have the Edwards Plateau, the hill country, otherwise known as the hill country. Excuse me. The Trans-Pecos is the mountains, everything on the other side of the Pecos River. So, the Davis Mountains, Fort Davis, the Guadalupe, the Chizos Mountains, and Big Bend National Park. Those little mountain ranges out there are all an extension of like the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Madre Oriental, which is further south in Coahuila in Mexico. That's why we really need this other map of Mexico, but maybe next time. It's really cool. People don't know that we have those little they're called sky islands. They exist like in New Mexico and southeastern Arizona also. It's little mountain ranges. And if you're at the top of the Davis Mountains, you will find aspen stands in Texas. There are aspen stands in West Texas, believe it or not. Not many of them, probably count them on one hand or maybe two hands, but they exist. So you go from that to East Texas, which is what we call, the Piney Woods. That's an extension. That's the furthest west extension of the southeastern United States. So that Piney Woods ecosystem runs all the way to basically Washington, D.C., along the southeastern part of the country. I mean, if you think about all the different species that are adapted, all the different plants and wildlife that are adapted to these different ecosystems or these different forest systems in one state, that's why Texas is one of the most biodiverse states. I mean, it is arguably the most. I mean, I think some might say California or those kinds of things. I'll go with Texas, right? So there's a lot of variation. There's forests in every one of these ecosystems, and this is a map that kind of points that out. This is the A&M Forest Service put this map out. There's a thing that says you are here, but we're not there. Where we're at here is the good old home here. And so these are really, really generic major forest types. They don't really do justice to kind of like the real diversity of forest ecosystems, but just generally speaking, I mean, you can see that really pine softwood forest in the east, and that wood in East Texas, I mean, has built a lot of Texas. A lot of the houses we live in here in the valley, and other parts of the state. The wood came into probably that, if your house is built probably before 1960, I mean, your house came in on the frame of your house came in on a railroad car, and that pine wood to build the frame of your house was milled probably in East Texas. So when you're doing like a tear down or a remodel or something like that, you might see like Temple or one of these names on the beams or something like that. And that's kind of like a lineage back to a lot of those forests that were kind of being cut down in the early 20th century, late 1800s and early 20th century. And as you can see down here, it's just they've got a real basic generic kind of, mesquite. And then you don't see a lot of forest and you'll see that more in more detail in a minute because, it was cleared. It was cleared prior to really having a really good understanding, and certainly before this map that was made, the ecosystem down here was lost to a large extent. And you can see just north of here, like in Kennedy County. So when you're going up Highway 77 or 281, you see those oak mott's. That's a whole different ecosystem just north of the valley. And the reason why that is because it's what's called the sand sheet. And that substrate is basically, a lot of those sand dunes they actually migrate, they move over time. And that live oak, it's not the same live oak you buy at Home Depot, but there's a lot of different varieties of live oak, native varieties. And so over time, if you look at the historical record for just north of here, a lot of those oak moths didn't exist, 150, 200 years ago. There's no indication of them in the historical documents. They talk about maybe one or two trees out on the coast there. And so a lot of those forests you see now, like forests of oak trees, just north of here, a lot of that has kind of come up over time through fire suppression, and that kind of thing. It wasn't the case here in the valley and so we're in the delta of the Rio Grande. So we'll dig into the valley finally here. This is the delta of the river on both sides. There's our part of it, and then Tamaulipas has their part of it, just south of us. And so we are there. That black outline there is the Tamaulipan Biotic Province, or the South Texas Plains on that map I had a couple of slides ago. It's the same thing. So basically, this is a binational. I mean, it's a transboundary ecosystem. So it starts up around San Antonio, and it runs about 400 miles south of Victoria and Tamaulipas. So and then once you get south of there, then you kind of get into some of the tropic, some more tropical forest and that kind of thing right on the Gulf Slope. So we're really close. We're riding about 4 hours north of some of the continent's northernmost tropical cloud forest, which is really cool. And so on that north end, it's really dry. It's the that's a picture of the Edwards Plateau there. And we have a bunch of species that grow in the valley that make it all the way up there, believe it or not, to the hill country, like Texas persimmon, and some other species that kind of make it all the way up there. But what's really cool about us here in the valley is that we get that tropical influence from a lot of things that grow only further south of us. They don't have a range in the United States outside of just the 4 counties in the valley. So that's a lot of our species down here, believe it or not. They don't extend any further north in the valley. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such incredible biodiversity down here, even with the loss of the habitat and that kind of thing. And this is just like a sampling of that kind of gratuitous picture of wildlife, valley biodiversity. But this is what it's about. This is what ecosystem. This is what conservation and ecosystem restoration. These things that buy us more time to save these kinds of species that are already limited, as I just kind of indicated. If something doesn't exist outside the 4 counties of the valley, and you're trying to put together a national effort to preserve it. I mean, the national effort is only limited to the 4 counties of the valley. So it's where can you find habitat, and it's almost like a question of time if you're going to keep these species or you're going to lose them forever after they lose their habitat and become locally extinct. So ocelot, green jay, that's the Altamira oriole, the blue-winged butterfly, white-winged dove. Hey, I mean, it's all part of the same ecosystem. So that's really something that's important to kind of point out. So officially, we thorn scrub or thorn forest. Folks, when I was growing up, my grandpa just referred to it as brush. I mean, it's this is brush, but we talked about semantics at the beginning. It's like if you sit there and you just talk about it as brush, and you you associate it with that, it's like it's not really fair. It's kind of taking the value of it away. And so, depending on where it grows or what soils this ecosystem grows on, that determines at the end of the day whether it's more like a forest or a scrub. If it's in some of the deeper soils along the river, or kind of where most of the developed valley is now, a lot of that was forest. I mean, it was really thick stuff. And thorn scrub you might see more of in some of the more moisture limited areas, maybe Starr County, some of these other areas. But a lot of these species are, like I said, subtropical, trees, shrubs, vines. Believe it or not, some of these mature, like old growth, what we would call old growth thorn scrub, pieces down here, like a Santa Ana or some of these other areas, they can have somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 plants per acre. That's wild. That's so dense that, I mean, you couldn't even crawl through it on your stomach. I mean, and we all, I mean, those of us who have been in it, it's like if you don't have a trail through it, you're not going anywhere, right? I mean, it with some of this stuff that is like, really, really old. So we're we'll talk about it in a minute, but those are the kinds of conditions that we want to try to restore in some areas, right? Because species like ocelot, they require that super dense stuff. They're most at home in that kind of habitat. So that's what you have to provide for them if you want them to kind of build new territories and, have, mate and that kind of thing, enlarge the population, expand the population. Again, U.S. distribution is the valley only. This is just real basic, but I mean, you hear a lot more about ecosystem services in today's world and that value of the forest when it comes to water filtration, carbon sequestration, talk about mitigating greenhouse gases and climate change. Well, that carbon has to be stored somewhere, right? It can be stored in different places, but forests are a nature-based solution for carbon sequestration wherever we have them, here in the valley, anywhere else. And so again, erosion control, all that after the rains we had over the last couple of weeks, you hear all that water moving through the ditch, and it's like a lot of that's coming off of farmland or some other exposed spaces that, if it had vegetation still on it, it probably wouldn't be eroding as much. And all that's headed for the Laguna Madre, and it's going to have an impact on, if nothing else, fishing, right? If you're really into fishing or you like to go into that kind of, the coastal ecosystem, that's really important. It's all connected. I'm talking today about forests, about the thorn scrub ecosystem in the valley, but that's not the entirety of the valley's natural world. We have grasslands in the valley, we have aquatic ecosystems, but they're all connected to each other. It's all, at the end of the day, it's all connected. The way you treat one is going to end up impacting the way what you can get or what can be understood or managed out of another part of that larger kind of natural landscape. Nature tourism is huge. If you hadn't heard, over 130 million. Some estimates put it over 300 million annually. If you look at the collective, impact of, hotel receipts, purchases for binoculars or food at the restaurant as people are out there birding, it's wild. I mean, this is something that we hit on. I use this as a point nationally to sell corporate funders on sponsoring our work down here. That's a huge point for me, is talking about the nature tourism aspect. And there's inevitably always somebody that's like, yeah, I've been down there, I'm a birder and that kind of thing. So it's like, it's the best kind of, exposure and press that we can get a lot of times, is that nature tourism industry. Obviously recreation here regionally, especially for all of us who are here, 12 months out of the year and need these wild spaces. And then biodiversity conservation, we'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, we hit on it earlier with all the rare and endangered species, or threatened species of concern, as we call them. This I'll go through this really quick, but this just gives you an idea of all the different technical background, technical breakout of the different kinds of thorn forests that exist down here. So for our purposes, we'll call it just the thorn forest ecosystem. But if you're going to literally get down in the weeds and study it, there's a lot of different variations. And then again, because we're flat here in the valley, a lot of that has to do with just very basic changes in elevation. If you've kind of followed the LNG piece out in the Brownsville Ship Channel and that kind of thing, they talk about the Loma evergreen. So they have basically their own ecosystem type, and what that is an indication of is how rare and fragile that ecosystem is. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not, in fact, they're so rare, the lomas are so rare that there's probably speciation or things like that going on from one loma to the next. That's been floated with some in the research community over the years. So the palm groves, South Texas palm groves, we're down to 2 palm groves near Brownsville. That used to be probably a fairly continuous sable palm forest all the way from the mouth of the Rio Grande up like 70 or 80 miles. I mean, it's wild to understand that was there historically, so there's a lot of variations. So all I'm saying is, it's not just one kind of massive stuff. It's like, there's a lot of nuance to it when you get down to studying it. and so the drivers of the change, right? We kind of come to it. The valley was part of Spain and then part of Mexico for large periods of its time, and the settlement patterns basically, and the way that folks brought in cattle, and then farming ranching has been going on in the valley since approximately 1750. I mean, Reynosa was founded in about 1740, 48 or 49, something like that. That the settlements on the south side of the river were the first ones to be founded. There was nothing here in the valley for another 150 years. The valley as we know it really came into existence in the first part of the early 1900s, outside of Brownsville. Brownsville and Rio Grande, the city, are a little older, Starr County. But the developed part of the valley is a much newer construct. But this is the major, what has caused the major landscape change was, the introduction of cattle and that fire suppression, and that, the kind of moving around, through their droppings, those kinds of things, the processes like that, moving around mesquite, the infestations of mesquite, if you will. And, everybody's got their way to kill mesquite, with diesel and whatever, you want to, whatever kind of combination of herbicide, but it was here historically. It's just, the concentrations of it are now off the chart because of those disturbances. And then farming changed everything in the early 1900s, 1900, 1910. And then, if we look at more recent change, there's, what we know to be the case is just the, massive scale of urbanization that the valley is undergoing right now, really over the last 25 years. I'm from Harlingen. I grew up here, and I can remember, when I was a kid, I mean, there was still space in between the towns, that kind of thing. And so you hear, everybody has their own story and that kind of thing. But these are, I mean, there's no turning back the clock. I mean, it's restoration, habitat restoration down here is a strategic enterprise. Where can we do it to have the most impact on, what we're trying to get out of it, whether it's biodiversity conservation or recreation. We're not going to restore the entire valley's landscape. That story's already been written. But with these changes, the valley's connection to the outside world, you kind of see development there in various forms, trade, all the good things that drive our economy, and the things that we, that we're all very much invested in on a day-to-day basis. All those things, if not done responsibly, they have an even more detrimental impact on nature, and the natural world. And all that comes back at the end of the day to cause problems, not just for the biodiversity that's dependent on that, but for us as well. So with, on that, I put that tree in there. That's the water table. When the river was dammed, starting with the bigger dams went in the 1950s. From that time forward, the water tables and the hydrology of the region has just been really changed. I mean, when I was a kid, we would go to Santa Ana in the back along the river, and you wouldn't see the sun. You would go along that river trail, and the cedar elms, that's a cedar elm tree, they were so thick and so luxurious that, you didn't see the sun. You were under the shade, the canopy the entire time. And now those trees they're just dying away one by one. And same thing at Benson, Rio Grande, and parts of that park, and that's part of the reason, why there's been, different management strategies that have come in over time to try to bring back some of that hydrology in some shape or way or form. This just underscores this is kind of that larger picture. There's a composite there of aerial photographs from the 1930s that does exist of the valley. So it's kind of, this is Cameron County, but it's the same trajectory for Willacy and Hidalgo County as well. You can kind of see still in that dark black color, it's still large areas of thorn scrub that still existed comparatively back then. A lot of it had already been cleared out around Brownsville and Harlingen there, but in the succeeding decades, it was all pretty much wiped out. And those patches, a lot of those bigger patches there in 83 and 2001 are wildlife refuge units. So they've got some protection on them, and if they didn't, they would have been cleared too. They wouldn't be there either. This is a map from one of our productions, but it's basically what we call core areas. This is super technical, right? But I mean, it's patches of thorn scrub that are of a certain size that we feel like, can support, a certain number of species, and or processes, if you will. They're large enough to still support some of the processes that exist naturally, but as you can see, there's not many of them left. It's really the dark green that we're looking at on that map. So Starr County still has, lots of contiguous acreage. Not all of that is what we would call high quality. Some of that, I can't remember if this is LiDAR or just satellite based, the source here, but some of those patches have already been cleared, and that's like regrowth of like mesquite. So like just mesquite growing in there in some of those patches, but we don't differentiate on that here. And so at the end of the day, what we do have here is the National Wildlife Refuge System. So these are public lands. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers the Wildlife Refuge System. I'll do a few slides on the Fish and Wildlife Service because they're a major partner of ours. They're a major reason why we're here. Why American Forest has decided to become more established regionally. We do this. We have the same relationship as an organization with the Forest Service in the Western United States. So this is kind of like the same version of that here regionally. So public land managers, and there's a lot of work to be done on these public lands. But we have 3 refuge. We have actually 2 complexes. We have the Laguna Atascosa complex on the coast, which is now separate actually from the Lower Rio Grande Valley complex, which is headquartered at Santa Ana, but Santa Ana is actually its own refuge. Go figure, right? That's the way the breakdown works. But the important thing about this is that this is a network of public lands. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is still acquiring lands in the valley. People say, "Oh, are they done?" No, they are still acquiring lands down here to build out this larger master plan or their vision they have within their agency to kind of create those conditions for connectivity and conservation regionally. So that's still going on, but it's the value of these public lands, as the whole area urbanizes and more pressure is put on them, the value becomes almost like magnified, right? The foresight to kind of get the refuge system started right around the early 1940s, so World War II time period, is just the foresight to get that going was just incredible. And this is just kind of like a deeper dive on it. So public lands restoration, habitat restoration in the valley, the principles are the Fish and Wildlife Service in the state. Texas Parks and Wildlife does not do as much restoration, habitat restoration, or reforestation as they once did, but they still do a little bit of it. So those are just stats: 200,000 trees planted annually at about 1,000 trees an acre. So that's 200 acres, and about 17,000 acres restored over the last 40 plus years. The important thing to note here is that, they can't do all that on their own. They have to have partner support. And that's, again, where American Forests and other nonprofits have kind of worked in over time. And the needs, these needs will just keep, if you think about these 3 needs, they will keep on showing up in one form or another throughout the rest of the presentation. That need to increase the landscape connectivity between these different forest core areas or patches. Because, you have to have connectivity to keep populations alive, right? So we when we talk about the ocelot, we say, well, we will make a priority out of building wildlife crossings for the ocelots to survive, and we'll reforest areas so they can move along corridors. The reason why that's so important is if the ocelots can't find each other across this landscape that's very, fragmented now, it's no longer forested. If they can't find each other, then over time, those populations that are in those forested areas now, they could die off. It's like a genetic bottleneck, if you will. They're losing genetic variation, and they're not the only species, right? So just kind of multiply that and think about some of the other species that can't move. When we say, well, birds can fly. Yeah, that's true. But what about Texas tortoises and some of these other species that they're not known to really go very far. They have what are called home territories. They're not known to go very far outside of that. So if we can't build in connectivity in this landscape for those species, those populations, and ultimately the whole population might be doomed to go, locally extinct. So that's why there's that whole focus on connectivity. And wildlife crossings are part of that, but they're not the only, part of that equation. Expanding restoration capacity, right? I mean, even if we can build the wildlife crossing, if there's no habitat for them to go to, what's the point of that crossing at the end of the day? It's the full suite of things, right? At the end of the day, we have to invest in the full suite of tools for conservation, and those are parts of it. And then this is a huge one. This one's huge for me, and it has impact, I think, for a lot of y'all probably listening, because you're in school, for a reason. We know so little about this ecosystem. Most of it was basically destroyed long before anybody was really taking note. Again, that semantics part, or my grandpa and your grandpa and all this other stuff. It's like I always think sometimes I'm doing this right, and my grandpa passed away years ago, but I could be rolling in his grave if he knew I was like restoring a habitat. And when he cleared it, right, he was working to clear it, that kind of thing, all those years ago. Oh, you're taking us back in time. So expanding, or I think we're done here. Yeah, so invest in that research to ID the management practices. That's a huge one. Little deeper dive on their restoration program. The Fish and Wildlife has an in-house restoration program. These are components to it. So they are growing over 30 species of native forest trees and shrubs to restore on the landscape. Over 30 species. I mean, if you go to like the Western United States and you get into some of those forests, those folks are replanting with 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 species. So we are trying to maximize diversity, because that's what we're about here. Our ecosystem is that diverse, and we're trying to restore those conditions. I won't go through all these, but there's a lot of moving parts. You can see that the restoration program has many different pieces. There's a planning part to it, and these roll out at different times of the year. So if you're, the planning part will be in the spring, and then the production is like in the summertime and the fall. The outplanting, we plant our forests here in the fall and the wintertime, because we have the mild weather in the winter. So there's all those different pieces in there. We'll talk about a couple of them on a few slides here. And then at the end of the day, after you don't walk away from it. There's success monitoring. You have to go out and you have to look at the plot. Whether you planted 100 acres or 5 acres, you got to go out there and figure out what the survivorship rate was, because that loop of information, of data, is what helps you get better at what you're doing, right? That's how you improve for the next go around. And whether it's go out there and maybe these species didn't make it because it was a drier year, or there's no supplemental watering. We don't go out and plant and then water the field. The only way it gets watered is if it rains, right? So a lot of these species are already drought tolerant, but it's real critical in the early periods. So the picture is just kind of, that's a seedling on the bottom part there. The hand that's kind of holding that's a seedling. That's the size of the trees that go in the ground, basically. There's a nursery picture. There's one of our colleagues collecting seeds in the back of a truck. And then there's that tube there is basically the actual seedling, the thorn forest seedling is actually inside that tube at the bottom of it. That's a tube to actually help protect the seedling for the first year or so of its growth. And just kind of really, we'll kind of go through this. This is it's like anything else, right? The program has evolved over time. When they started back in the early 80s, they had a different interpretation of success. And so there was a lot of what was called direct seeding. So they would go out and collect lots of seeds and just plant the seeds. And so like on that picture on the top part there, you can see just rows. They're still planted in rows, by the way, but you can just see rows and rows of those are like rows and rows of like ebony trees, in some of these areas. Or here too, just rows and rows and rows. Over time they realize, well, I mean, we're going to have to, that's where we need the diversity, right? We need to shake this up. We need to be planting more or different kinds of species instead of just like the one same species in rows, like a plantation or that kind of thing. And the other part about direct seeding is that, and it still has its proponents, and what what Fish and Wildlife found is that the success rate was really low. Some of these stands, I mean, they just they were like single digit survivorship. Like if you go out and plant 100 acres and you turn around and come back a few months later and only 5% of it survived, I mean, it's basically a waste of time and effort, that kind of thing. So now compare that to where we're at now, and what the standard that we've used since roughly the mid 90s is seedling outplanting. So collecting the seed, right? All the seeds are collected. They're what's called wild collected. So you go out into wherever you can find a patch of the species and you collect the seeds. You kind of follow its phenology throughout the year. There'll be a point where it's going to fruit, and that's when you collect the seeds. But then instead of just turning around and putting them in the ground, and now you take them to the nursery, and now we grow them out. So they grow out. It generally takes about 6 to 8 months, somewhere in there, to get most of our species grown out, and that's the product at the end of the day. These are all all that diversity of species in these crates, and they're all waiting to be planted. That's one that's been planted in the ground there. And then after you plant it, then you put the tube on it, a stake in a tube. And what that tube does is it maintains moisture around the base. So like, if there's rain or something like that, fog, these tubes will kind of wick that moisture down to the root zone. The young plant needs the moisture just around its root zone. It doesn't need it out over here because the roots haven't gotten there yet. And then the other part of the really cool part about this, there's multiple parts, but it in a lot of these areas where we do the reforestation, we'll have deer or nilgai or those kinds of things come in, and they'll come in after we plant if there's no tubes, and they'll just eat the whole plant down to the ground and basically kill it. So this kind of protects it from that herbivory, that pressure from herbivory, that kind of thing, for a little bit of time till it gets older, and then it won't have as many problems. But excuse me, the limitations are there. I mean, it's like, how many seeds can you really collect, and at the end of the day, how many seedlings can you grow per year? I had that slide on a few minutes ago that talked about the upper end of our capacity for reforestation being, maybe 200 acres a year, 200,000 seedlings. And because that limitation is there, when a larger piece of land is bought for conservation purposes, and there's a need to restore most of this. So this is Saldaré, off of 186. This is Los Venados, I think, that subdivision, but this was purchased like in the 1980s, I think, the tract, but they knew even back then that it would take decades to restore it fully, right? And so there's that legend there, has the different years. They took on from like 92 to 95, they took on, these sections, and you can, follow that along. But it's like, if we had the capacity to do more, we could have probably knocked that out a lot quicker. We wouldn't have had to have drug it out so long. We could have gone on to the next one, kind of thing. So those are just things that, the rest of the presentation will kind of hit on, those capacity limitations. We're lucky with this tract of land, with this Fish and Wildlife tract, because there's basically a mostly uncleared piece right across the road, and that's what we kind of use. That's what we've historically used as like reference conditions. Like if you want to know what to restore on Saldaré, then you're going to go into that. This is the Schleben tract next door there. You're going to go onto Schleben and kind of look at the vegetation and figure out, well, this grows here, so then we'll put that in our restoration mix if we see it growing in that mature forest next door. That's kind of business as usual. That's the way things have been done historically around the restoration kind of conversation, the planning. And beyond the capacity challenge, there's that what we call garden variety challenges of invasive species. I mentioned nilgai, the same thing with feral hogs, right? Everybody's got their feral hog story. And it's the same thing. They'll go in there and they'll destroy plantings. Arguably, though, our biggest problem is invasive grasses. We've got 2 or 3 species of grass down here that remember I was talking about succession before, and how that it looked like a nice linear kind of progression from bare ground or farm field all the way to mature forest. Well, the problem is these invasive grasses are already in the seed bank, right? All those weeds are already in the seed bank, and before you've even gotten out of the plot planting, those grasses are starting to sprout, or they come in about a year or 2 after you've started, when the plants are still small. So what they do is they basically stop that succession, that natural success. It's why we have to do the seedlings. We can't just walk away from a field like an old farm field down here and expect it to turn into Santa Ana or something like that. That just doesn't work like that. And a big part of that is because of these invasive grasses, the density that they're here. And then the deeper challenges, this is kind of like along the priorities for American forests at the national level. We have we're in a space where we're trying to be, or we're not trying to be. I mean, we're kind of in that forefront of groups who are looking at reforestation, but are also looking at those climate change projections and how that's going to change the equation for restoration over time. So for what that means here in the Valley is those deeper challenges, right? I mean, we're talking about, if you look at those projections, we're already seeing some of this, right? I mean, these drier and hotter towards the middle part of the century. There's just some visuals there to kind of tie in with that kind of thought process. But and so when you've got these long-term trends like that, and we're talking about a long-term practice when reforestation and forest ecology. So what kind of influence do they have on reforestation practices? If it's going to be a much drier future, should we be restoring with just kind of business as usual in mind, or should we be trying to kind of like add in or kind of change our some of our standards or our practices around reforestation, and that's kind of what that is, that proactive planning part. And along those same lines, it's kind of like a first step. There's this there have the advances within the program that have existed over the last 10 or 12 years or 13 years. Believe it or not, one of those advances is tree shelters. Prior to probably 2015 or maybe 2013, we weren't using tree shelters on our plantings. And so again, there was just this ridiculous, in some cases, I mean, there was like single digit survivorship, like 7 or 8% of the plot survives. And with tree shelters, not so much depends on what the conditions are in a given year. I mean, a drought is a drought. If you plant in a drought, you're going to have more mortality. You're going to lose more seedlings than in a wetter year, because we don't have the supplemental water. But at the end of the day, everything being equal, those tree shelters have allowed us to kind of get to a point where, and on most plots with using tree shelters, I mean, the survivorship is north of 80%, 80, 90, 95%. That's a wild difference. It's a real game changer. But again, they cost money, right? It's all about, return on investment, and certainly reforestation is right up at the top of that list. And then again, focusing restoration on the most suitable soils, heavier soils that can retain more. We talk about how the Valley has different soils, clays and sands, and that's certainly is extremely relevant to reforestation or habitat restoration as well. Trying to stay in this band of high density outplanting, 1,000 seedlings an acre, somewhere around there, give or take. And then continuing to, plant that diversity of species. And that's just the tubes. That's a plant growing in the tube, and there's a plant growing out of the tube there. So hang on really quick. This next set of slides, we're getting through it here. This is basically American forests in the Rio Grande Valley. This is like a wheel basically, and this is what we call our change model. So my work here in the Valley is one of probably about 4 or 5 what we call place-based partnerships that we have throughout the United States. So we've got one in California, one in Oregon, one up near the Yellowstone ecosystem. So American Forest several years ago identified these high impact areas where reforestation and forest conservation was like most needed. And to their credit, American Forests, realize what the issue was. American Forest has had a presence with the Fish and Wildlife Service, a partnership for over 25 years. But to come in and try to build a partnership around reforesting this landscape, that's been a larger commitment on their behalf. So this is the model that we would use pretty much in any one of those landscapes, right? But I'll just go around it really quickly. So you really need, so in other words, you need all of these pieces to put the long-term, to have that long-term impact on forest conservation in any one of these geographies in the valley. You really have to have all these pieces, and many of them, there's so many more, they're not listed on here. But the most immediate thing is building reforestation capacity. And for what that has meant for this region and for American Forest, for my efforts, is to kind of build out assistance and sponsored research here regionally. And then in terms of capacity, building the reforestation pipeline, if you will. We talked about, a few slides ago, how we need to restore more acres, or it would be ideal to be able to do that. That starts with, investment on seed collection. So we've been doing that. These are on the ground activities. And then we have more recently moved into planting community forests, and also working with environmental literacy programming for residents. And so that actually doesn't have like a connection here, but that's like, maybe that should be down here. I need to update this slide. But here we have Plan Guided by Science. That's the Thorn Forest Conservation Plan. I'll show you that in a minute. And then climate adaptation strategy planning. That part on the bottom right that says advocate and fund, that's so critical, right? I mean, that's, if you don't have, and this is really where we shine as a nonprofit. There's a lot of agencies, that agencies have capacity, right? But if they don't have those lines of funding that are drawn from DC, that kind of thing, from Washington, or even from Austin for the state, and so much of our other partners are really Austin based as well. If we don't have that, then we can come up with the best plan there is to do reforestation, and it'll never go anywhere because we have to have those larger pots of funding. This is extremely expensive work. And so that policy advocacy at the national level is huge. And that's where nonprofits really shine in the conservation sphere, because they can do things that agencies can't. They can advocate for, funding pathways and projects that maybe the agency couldn't internally. That's kind of like the symbiosis, or the relationship, one aspect of it that's so important. I mentioned there that we plant and restore forests, so we've been that's like dollar per dollar support to actually do the restoration itself. So right now we're up to about $6 per seedling right now in the valley to plant. That's a lot of money per seedling if you factor in compared to other geographies, if you factor in the cost of tree tubes and the labor contracts to plant them. Somebody's got to do all that by hand. I mean, it's like old school. So we have worked with them to plant over 2 million trees in the valley. So a lot of the restored acres out there, American Forest was somehow involved. You probably on the back end, but was somehow involved on funding a lot of those plantings. The comms piece is critical. The video productions, the articles. I'm happy to. I don't have those on here, but I do have some links that I can share later on that we'll give our specialized productions that we put together for our work here regionally. The social media, it all counts, right? I mean, I do tweet from time to time, but it's amazing. What do they say? A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I mean, I can sit there and write as many conservation plans as I want to, but it's only going to ever hit a certain demographic. A certain demographic is only going to ever look at that, right? So it's those video productions, it's all those other pieces that really communicate your message out to that public, or that group that's wanting to sponsor you, the sponsors, right? And then the partnership building is what we've developed over the last few years, the Thorn Forest Conservation Partnership. I'll go over that in a minute. I'll just the last few slides here are kind of focused on these areas that I haven't, circled in red. The other ones are just as important, but I'll spend the last few slides going over these. So in the spirit of building partnership here regionally, over the last several years, I've been this is a group that we helm, American Forest basically chairs. It's a de facto stakeholder organization that's really just basically focused on restoring this habitat, the thorn scrub ecosystem here regionally. This is a sampling of, like, those of us who are involved. There's a lot of other folks that are involved at this stage. But as you can see, it's if you kind of scan through there, it's organizations, it's agencies, nonprofits, groups, that researchers that have a vested interest in conserving what's left of this ecosystem, and kind of building out that connectivity over time. If all of us are individually working on our own projects, right? It's like anything else, but as a team, as a group, there's so much more capacity when we come together and we work on projects. And a huge part of that's just information sharing, right? I mean, there has never been an effort like this to kind of pull together a stakeholder organization that was focused on this one ecosystem. So it really is, when you're looking at the value of the partnership as a whole, the TCP, as we call it, the thing that really strikes me, and the thing that I take a lot of value in, that really saves me a lot of times, is every organization on here has a specialization. Some might be more better at land acquisition, those kinds of things, and others might be better at reforestation. Others might be better at communication. So it's drawing, obviously, the focus, on research with UTRGV and Cesar Kleberg and other folks. Everybody, it's that whole, it's that collective that really allows us to kind of see that bigger picture and try to plan forward. And as far as planning forward, this is really our seminal kind of collective effort up to this point. It's still fairly new. We finished up with it last year. But there's a timeline there, was in the middle of COVID, and so it was slowed down a little bit, but the capacity is land managers, community members, local government, researchers. And that first order as a group has been to catalyze that reforestation planning. The concept of connectivity has been around for decades. That is, for example, that's what drives that land acquisition and that process with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've been doing that since, go back into the late 70s, early 80s. So it's not a new concept. It's just, the landscape is changing down here so quickly, and science changes and developments change. So it's like, what is the modern version of that, and then how can we use this plan to build in more investment? Because that's what it really is at the end of the day. It's a manifesto. And I invite you to go on to the website there and have a look at it. It's about 70, or I think it's about 60 or 70 pages, but it's very detailed. Put on your thinking cap when you get in there, but it's broken down by sections. It talks about the need. There's the process there, modeling analysis. There's a very good description of how all that went. And again, science-based. It's not just anecdotal or we need to restore this over here, let's go do it. It's where can we restore in this landscape, this imperiled landscape, where we have all this development pressure? Where can we do that in a way that gets us the most bang for our buck? If we want to save the ocelot, or if we want to save this population of wildlife, this particular species. And this was basically the deliverable from that plan. We identified corridors and core areas adjacent to existing core forests that could be reforested. And that all came out to over 80,000 acres that could be considered what we call top potential restoration sites. So and that inset there is the potential restoration sites as related to ocelot crossings, which are mostly in Cameron County along the coast at Laguna, which is what it's, there's 3 ocelot subpopulations. There's one at Laguna, at Tascosa inside the refuge. There's one on the Ituria Ranch north of Raymondville, which is a Fish and Wildlife and Nature Conservancy easement. And then there is a population on the East Foundation, the El Sal's ranch. So those are our three subpopulations. And together we're looking at like, 80, maybe 70 or 80 cats. Ocelot is our charismatic species. We build a lot of our funding narratives around ocelot conservation, obviously, because that's what, if you're saving, but think about it, if you're saving ocelot habitat, you're really saving, you're creating habitat, you're preserving habitat for all the other species that use that same habitat. So they're what we call an umbrella species or a focal species. And then as far as planning goes, incorporating, we talked about the threats to the deeper challenges to reforestation, but really being able to actually put that into words, be able to put that into planning is what this document in 2021 was about. That exists online too. I don't have the link here, unfortunately, but it's in the Fish and Wildlife Service on the ServCat, the online library. And again, it's that adaptation that, if we know extreme weather, more extreme than what we have now, right? Which is hard to believe, but if we know more of that is on the way, then it serves, it's due diligence to try to start turning the wheel, start trying to figure out, how we can modify that business as usual restoration planning and maybe improve that resilience, kind of as you read through there. Improve our chances of, improve the chances of that forest being able to survive long term. We don't harvest our forest here. We're not like a forest in East Texas or the Western U.S. We're not looking at some kind of harvest somewhere down the road. So that's the trick is like if you're trying to create habitat for ocelots, you're expected, it's a heavy lift to try to think about all the things that you have to do up front to try to replicate some form of mature habitat that you may have down the road that ocelot may use. That's when you think about that, it's like you almost have to get it right from the start. And there's a lot of expense and a lot of planning, but things like this build capacity and they allow us to, at least find some way to address these concerns within the agency or within the larger kind of regional planning for reforestation. We work locally to do seed collection. We do a large percentage at this stage. We've been doing this for 2 years. We do a large part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's seed collection for their in-house restoration, the part that they do in-house at their nursery, and that's Giselle. She's my restoration manager. So she's out there today, she's out there collecting seeds from over, I think we're up to like 40 to 50 species of different plants throughout the year. She collects 12 months out of the year in some parts of the country, right? I mean, they go home and spend the winter inside. Giselle doesn't do that. She's out collecting seeds 12 months out of the year and processing so we can have seeds and plants for the next year. So she holds that down out there, and with student support. We have some agreements to RGV. So if anybody wants to go out collecting seeds with Giselle, I'll put you in touch with her, and it's fun stuff. It's always amazing to get out there. More recently, community engagement, something that we've been planning to get into. COVID kind of slowed us down quite a bit. But we were able to do an inaugural, first 1 acre community forest planting in San Carlos back in December. And the really cool part about that is there is an environmental literacy program attached to that. So this is working with Commissioner Torres, Precinct 4. And this is county land out there on the other side of the new complex that's going in out there. So the long-term vision there is to have a trail and a pond and an amenity basically, so folks can enjoy it, but also understand, what goes into it. The concept here is bringing reforestation into the community. We talk about this. We say, how many people are actually, did you know Santa Ana existed or that kind of thing? Yes, I've heard about it. Have you ever been there? No. And it's like 10 miles down the road or 5 miles down the road. And so, how many folks just can't get there or they won't of their own volition? Well, if we can bring more of these kinds of things into the community, you know, San Carlos is surrounded by fields right now, but in 5 or 10 years or 20 years, it's all going to be houses. All those fields are going to turn into houses. So, or most of them. So it's like that'll be a long-term resource, you know, for the community. That's how we see it, and our partners, including Commissioner Torres and others. So if we can expand that kind of concept across the valley over time, that will be a very positive development. And again, it's introducing communities to reforestation and the importance of you know, the fact that we need natural spaces. It can't all be built out. We can't have cement in every single spot. It's just that's not a recipe for resilience or fill in the blank, sanity, etc. As time moves forward in the valley. And then this is, I was going to kind of get close. I'm getting close to finishing up here. But then the sponsored research part, very clearly, and this involves probably a lot of folks on the call. It all comes back down to you at the end of the day. I mean, it's what the next generation, what y'all are going to end up doing with this landscape. You're going to inherit it one way or the other, and what are you going to do with it? You know, will you work to try to advance conservation, you know, species conservation, whether, you know, or you know, save those processes or conserve or rebuild some of those processes that have been lost over time, through different, you know, through other different perspectives and you know, whatnot. So that this is really important. Sponsored research, we've been able to do some initial rounds of sponsored research with students at RGV in Edinburgh, for both lab and field-based studies. So there's a lot of folks, a lot of undergraduates who are really interested. I can't, you know, I went to UT Brownsville, you know, 25 years ago. And I mean, I wish this stuff had existed back then. It's just amazing the capacity that we have now. And we're like a powerhouse. I mean, we're just pushing out all kinds of students. I mean, all kinds of graduates and that kind of thing, with the focus on, you know, conservation or agriculture, sustainable agriculture. And it's just, we're known for it now in national circles, you know, some of these things like agroecology and those kinds of things. So our goal is to try to, you know, make the area known also for the how unique our ecosystem is. And certainly a big part of that is the answers and the student-led research, the original research. So many answers are coming from students. You know, it's not some big name staff researcher, you know, at an agency. It's master's students, it's undergrads that are figuring these things out, and they're putting these publications out there into science. So that's more of that, please, that kind of thing. That's what we need to find funding for. And we're doing that. And that larger goal is to inform restoration practices. At the end of the day, it's applied. You know, we talk about two different kinds of research. There's the theoretical that may just go into a volume somewhere and disappear. But how much of that, or how much of your research is actually applied? How much of the information coming out of your work can actually inform a Fish and Wildlife Service land manager in 2023, you know, that kind of thing, and help him choose a path that's more sustainable in terms of forest management and saving these species that he's responsible for. These are trust species, what we call trust species, the trust of the public, the trust that, you know, by their actions, these land managers, these federal land managers, state land managers, are going to find a way to save these populations of species before they're gone. And in game species as well. That, you know, there's no real, I don't draw a distinction between non-game, you know, agencies do and funding streams do, but, you know, whether it's white-winged dove or ocelot, they all depend on the same ecosystem. If you want to learn more, that's the website for my work down here. That larger American Forest website is just, it'll give you like a really good synopsis or you know, overview of all the work that we do in the United States, whether it's tree equity or the Resilient Forest Program. And that's all I've got, y'all. Thank y'all. There's a sunset at Soledad.
Well, thank you, John. I'm going to ask just a few questions because we are running out of time. But by the way, presentation was so good and it complemented our last presentation really well. That focus was mostly animals, and then you're talking about the habitat that these animals need. So thank you so much. There was a lot of buzz about fire. And then you also mentioned the suppression of fire over time. So historically, and by the way, this was asked by Matthew, historically, how frequent were fires in the Rio Grande Valley before we started to suppress them? I know we probably had a lot more grassland before, or maybe it was
Yeah.
in different areas. So if you have any insight on that.
We don't know. There's no way to really say what the frequency was. At the end of the day, you're right. I mean, based on our best knowledge and our best understanding of it, the valley was a mosaic, of thorn scrub and grasslands, and then wetlands, kind of like a big mosaic, but I don't have the answer to that. What I've understood and what I know is that, the natural thorn forest or natural thorn scrub, these denser areas are not fire adapted. So they didn't really burn. They didn't burn like forests out west. That now what's happened, unfortunately, is that these invasive grasses like buffalo grass and especially guinea grass get in there and they dry out and they change the ecology of the forest. So what hadn't been fire dependent is now open to that prospect, and that happens. I mean, that there is, in any given year, there's all kinds of lightning strikes out there, and we actually do reforestation on lightning strikes where the vegetation has burned, and you have to think to yourself, it probably wouldn't have burned at that intensity, if we didn't have those invasive grasses in that understory. But good question.
Okay, let's see. Next one. This one is from Javier. What would be a suggested ratio for man-made structures to like an urban forest? You have a suggestion for that?
I wish I did. That is an awesome question, Javier. Yeah, that's where we need to go. That's like next level stuff, is like, how many of these things do we need in the landscape, and while we have a chance, while the land is still, comparatively cheap or inexpensive. Is not cheap, but it's land price, they're not making any more of the land. So it's a really good question. I think what informs our effort to do community forestry right now is the willingness of local government partners. Commissioner Torres met us with arms wide open. And so if we can get that same reception with commissioners in the different precincts in the different counties, then we can probably expand the concept.
Thank you. And then we also had some questions about endangered species, and you did talk about the ocelot. Do you want to give any insight about plant species that might be endangered in the Rio Grande Valley?
Yeah, there's a number of species that are in Section 6 that are listed as threatened or endangered. I think from not all of those endangered plants are really, from the thorn scrub ecosystem. Some of them are more, common in the grasslands, but, or some kind of hybrid area where, a lot of times we'll just say, well, there's a sliding scale of basically canopy percentage. And if you're on the lower end of that, you're in a grassland. And at some point, as you go towards 100%, you get into a forest, like really dense stuff. So star cactus, probably exists on the lower end of that spectrum, closer to grassland. And then, of course, the Asclepias prostrata, is now a part of that conversation as well. And then Texas Ienia, some of these, species that are, I believe, in the mallow family. I mean, there's so little known about their reproductive biology. And so it really comes down to, we don't even know if the patches of habitat they exist in are sufficient. Going back to that genetic bottleneck question, we don't even know if there's enough diversity in those patches to actually carry those, make those, long-term, extant populations. So that's where you get into even more kind of crazier stuff like, reintroductions of different species.
Okay, thank you. And then they also were asking, like multiple people were asking, if you had a favorite type of forest, if you had a favorite type of plant, and then adding to that, this is just for us, for students to know, if students wanted to work in a position such as yours, what type of experience would they need? Can you share maybe some of your background or suggestions you have for students to get to a position like yours?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't I don't know. I mean, I love all the native species. I think if there's one, I love Texas ebony trees. Just the history that's about a lot of those trees you're looking at are probably, over 100 years old. Some of them might be closer to 200 years old. And the changes that they've seen in their life, they could talk, right? If walls could talk, if trees could talk. But yeah, that's probably my go-to on the plant species. As far as the career goes, there's, like I was saying before, there's so many more opportunities to get involved in study and appreciation of nature than there were, 20 years ago. Y'all are living in a much more, I mean, it's like, way ahead of where we were back in the day. And so I guess, your advantage will be to try to find internships with Fish and Wildlife or the state, and they're looking for them pretty regularly, to go in and kind of understand, there's different career paths. There's the nonprofit path is different from the agency path in conservation, or the education or the academic research path. If you really want to be a researcher, I mean, that's there's variation there, but they all share that love and that appreciation for that natural environment. I would have to say internships are probably one of the most valuable things you can do. And next to that, and maybe as part of that, is the volunteering. You're going to hear it a million times, but it's like, it not only does it look good on your resume, I mean, people respond to that. And because let's be honest, at the end of the day, this is not the medical sciences. If you're interested in the working in the natural in conservation, you're not going to be rich. It's just the way it is, I still try. I'm still, maybe I will be one. I'll find an angle there, but you really have to have a love and appreciation for it, and so the volunteering is huge. In my position, I worked for years as a temporary, like a project biologist, and I would do like 3 or 4 jobs a year working with different bird species. And that it wasn't all volunteer work, but the volunteer parts of that work took me to the Amazon, took me to Costa Rica, took me to Mexico several times. So I only know those places because I had that opportunity, and it's the same thing for y'all. If you can go online and find those, Texas A&M wildlife jobs, it's a 3 or 4, they're 3 or 4 month, 5-month jobs, but you learn so much and you see landscapes that you'll never see in your life, and have experiences you'll never see in your life, if you don't take that, opportunity.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And by the way, Georgie from our last talk, he also chose Texas ebony. So both of you have that in common. So we're going to leave it at that. We're at 7:30 p.m. So if you all are still here, thank you so much. We appreciate you. We're going to have a lot more talks coming up. So please, every time your teacher posts a flyer, please sign up. We do benefit. And then also leave us suggestions. If there is something you think we should be doing, if there's a different field, or if there's a speaker you have in mind, let us know. All of that feedback is appreciated. So again, thank you all, and we'll see you at our next speaker series.
Thank y'all.